The wheelchair hit the marble floor with a sharp crack as Nathaniel Voss spun around in frustration, knocking over a tray of champagne flutes that shattered across the hallway just outside the Hartwell Manor ballroom. A waiter rushed over, head bowed, already apologizing before he even reached the mess. Nathaniel didn't look at him. He was staring through the tall, arched doorway at the room full of people who had not looked at him once in the past 40 minutes. Not once. 300 people in that ballroom. Senators, CEOs, a former cabinet secretary who had once called Nathaniel at midnight to ask for a personal favor. A woman who had dedicated her published memoir to him by name. A man who had wept at the podium during Nathaniel's charity gala 2 years ago, his voice cracking as he described how Nathaniel's quiet generosity had saved his company and, he said, his family. Not one of them had crossed the room to say hello. Nathaniel straightened in his chair, adjusted the lapel of his dinner jacket, and told himself the anger he felt was cold and useful, not the hot, humiliating kind. He was good at telling himself things. He had been doing it since the accident. He rolled himself back through the doorway and into the ballroom, and the crowd parted for him the way water parts for a stone dropped into still water. Not with welcome, but with the instinctive, uncomfortable reflex of people who do not know where to look. He found his position near the far end of the room beside a column wrapped in ivory ribbon, and he stopped there and watched. The string quartet was playing something Viennese and bright. Waiters moved like shadows between clusters of guests who laughed at exactly the right volume and touched each other's arms at exactly the right moments. Everything was precise and expensive and entirely, suffocatingly false. Nathaniel knew false. He had built his first fortune on the ability to read a room, to see beneath the surface of a handshake or a smile to the calculation underneath. He had always known when he was being performed at rather than spoken to. It was a skill that had saved him in boardrooms and negotiation tables, and once, memorably, in a government hearing where a very polished attorney had tried to dismantle him in front of 4 senators. He had always known. He had simply chosen, for many years, to pretend he did not. Raymond Cross appeared from between 2 groups near the fireplace, moving with a loose, confident stride of a man who has never needed to wonder whether he belongs in a room. Raymond was 61, silver-haired, and wore his wealth the way certain men wear their skin, without ever thinking about it. He and Nathaniel had built their first major deal together 22 years ago in a rented conference room with a broken air conditioner and a shared bottle of terrible scotch. They had shaken hands across that table and looked each other in the eye, and Nathaniel had thought, this man I can trust. Raymond saw him now. Nathaniel watched it happen in real time. The microsecond of recognition, the slight shift in Raymond's expression, the recalibration, the decision. Raymond smiled. It was the kind of smile that does not reach anything above the cheekbones. He raised his glass fractionally in a gesture that could mean hello or could mean I see you and have chosen not to engage. And then he turned, smoothly, back to the conversation he had come from. Nathaniel sat very still. He was 11 years old again, standing outside the gymnasium at Franklin Middle School in Pittsburgh while the sounds of a birthday party he had not been invited to leaked under the door. He had stood there for 4 minutes before walking home in the dark. He had never told his father about it. His father, Arthur Voss, had worked the floor at a steel plant for 31 years and had very little patience for self-pity, and Nathaniel had understood even then that some wounds you carry quietly, or you don't carry them at all. He had not thought about that gymnasium in 40 years. He thought about it now, in the middle of his own ballroom, surrounded by 300 people who had eaten his food and drunk his wine and were busy pretending he was part of the furniture. He reached for the glass of water on the small table beside him. His hand was steady. He had trained it to be steady. Across the room, a woman in a pale green dress was telling a story that made the 4 people around her erupt in laughter. A man Nathaniel had once lent $2 million to, not as an investment, simply as a gesture, because the man's daughter needed a surgery that insurance would not cover. Was deep in conversation with a venture capitalist near the bar, and his face was animated and alive in the way it had never been when he spoke to Nathaniel. Not tonight. Not anymore. Nathaniel set the glass down. Here was the truth of it. Here was the thing he had been circling for 11 months. since the accident, since the surgeries, since the day Dr. Priya Okonkwo had sat across from him in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and explained in the gentlest possible professional language that the injury to his spinal cord was irreversible and that the life he had lived before would need to be renegotiated. Nathaniel had looked at her and said nothing for a very long time, and then he had said, "I don't negotiate." She had looked at him with something that was not quite pity and not quite sympathy, but something in between that he found much harder to bear than either. "Mr. Voss," she had said, "everyone does eventually." He had fired his first physical therapist 2 weeks later for using the word adapt. He had fired the second one for suggesting that a wheelchair did not have to represent limitation. He had kept the third one because the third one said almost nothing and simply worked, and Nathaniel respected that even when he hated everything else about the situation. The accident itself was almost insultingly ordinary. A rain-slicked stretch of highway outside Albany on a Tuesday night in November. A pharmaceutical truck crossing the median due to a blown tire. The sound of impact that he did not remember except as a sensation of sudden wrongness, like the world had been picked up and put back down at the wrong angle. He had been conscious in the wreckage long enough to feel the cold of the rain on his face and the particular absence of sensation below his waist that, even then, even in shock, he had understood was not temporary. 11 months. And here he sat. He had organized this evening himself. Every detail, the guest list, the caterers, the flowers, the Viennese quartet playing music his mother had loved. He had told Eleanor, his housekeeper, that it was a welcome-back gathering. He had told Raymond it was overdue. He had told his assistant to spare no expense and to make certain the list included everyone who had once called themselves close to him. He had lied to all of them. It was a test. A cold, deliberate, meticulously organized test. And the results were coming in with the kind of clarity that he had spent a lifetime respecting even when it cost him something. The results were, every single person in this room respected the man he used to be, and that man was gone, and they had not found a way to respect what remained. He had suspected this. He had known it, probably in some locked room at the back of his mind where he kept the things too difficult to look at directly. But knowing something and watching it demonstrated in real time across 300 people in your own ballroom are not the same experience. And Nathaniel sat with the full weight of it pressing down on him like a physical thing. He thought about his father. Arthur Voss had come home from the plant every evening smelling of metal and effort, and he had washed his hands at the kitchen sink with a particular thoroughness that Nathaniel had always associated with a kind of ritual. Not just cleaning, but a daily accounting, a moment of reckoning between the man he was at work and the man who sat down at the family table. Nathaniel had watched him do it thousands of times. When Nathaniel was 17, he had come to his father in a state of private collapse. A business idea he'd been nurturing for 2 years had been stolen, clumsily, but effectively, by a classmate whose father had the resources to execute it properly. Nathaniel had been furious and devastated and had made the mistake of letting both feelings show. His father had dried his hands on the dish towel and looked at him steadily and said, "Money is a shovel, Nat. You're not angry because you lost the shovel. You're angry because you thought the shovel was the point." Nathaniel had not understood it then. He had thought his father was deflecting, offering wisdom instead of sympathy, because sympathy was not something Arthur Voss was built for. He understood it now. All of this, the manner, the guests, the fortune, the decades of careful construction, all of it had been the shovel. He had confused the shovel for the point. And now the shovel was not gone. Not really. His fortune was intact. His company still ran. His name still opened doors. But the physical fact of the wheelchair had convinced every person in this room that the shovel had changed hands, that he was diminished, that the ledger had been rebalanced and his column had been adjusted downward. And so they moved around him without touching him, like he was something that might stain. He was about to turn toward the door when he heard the running footsteps. They were small and fast and completely out of place in the careful, measured atmosphere of the ballroom, and he turned toward them instinctively, and that was when he saw her. She was 8 years old, maybe 9, in a red dress that was clearly her best one, slightly too short at the hem, the collar a little stiff with newness, and she was moving through the ballroom with the absolute purposeful confidence of a person who has not yet learned that certain rooms are not meant for them. Her name was Maya, and she was Eleanor's daughter, and she had no business being in the ballroom at this hour, and none of that appeared to concern her in the slightest. She dodged a waiter. She slipped between two men in suits who parted for her with expressions of mild bewilderment. She was looking at something, and Nathaniel followed her gaze and realized, with a lurch of something he could not immediately name, that she was looking at him. She arrived in front of his wheelchair at a slight trot and stopped, slightly out of breath, and looked at him with the frank, assessing gaze of a child who has not learned to disguise curiosity as something more socially acceptable. "Why aren't you dancing?" she said, not unkindly, simply as a question that needed answering. Nathaniel stared at her. Around them, he was aware of a slight shift in the nearest conversations. Heads turning, attention swinging toward them with the cautious interest of people who sense something unusual is happening but cannot yet identify whether it is appropriate to watch. "The music is good," Maya added, in case he hadn't noticed. "I know the music is good," Nathaniel said. "I chose it. Then why aren't you dancing?" He looked at her for a moment. She waited with a patience that was somehow more adult than anything else in the room. "I can't dance," he said. "I can't walk." She glanced at his wheelchair. She looked back at him. She appeared to be thinking carefully, the way children think carefully when they're taking something seriously rather than just politely. "You don't need to walk to dance," she said. The room had gotten quieter. Nathaniel noticed this in the peripheral awareness of a man who has spent decades being conscious of rooms. The quartet was still playing, but the conversations nearest to them had thinned, and the people who had been ignoring him for 40 minutes were now watching with an attention they had not offered when he had simply existed in front of them. He looked at the small hand Maya extended toward him, palm up, with the gravity of a formal invitation. He thought about saying no. He thought about the 11 months of careful management, the controlled distances he had kept, the strategic armor of dignity through self-sufficiency that he had built and maintained and was, he now understood, also a kind of prison. He thought about his father washing his hands at the kitchen sink. He thought about the gymnasium in Pittsburgh. He took her hand. Maya smiled. It was enormous and entirely unself-conscious, the kind of smile that exists before a person learns to modulate their expressions for other people's comfort. She took a step back, and he moved his chair forward, and the quartet, he would find out later that the first violinist had tears in her eyes, shifted seamlessly into a slower waltz. They danced. It was not graceful. Maya had to adjust her steps constantly to accommodate the movement of the chair, and she laughed when she misjudged it, and her laughter was so genuine and unguarded that it made the adjustments feel like part of the dance rather than interruptions of it. Nathaniel moved the chair in careful arcs, and Maya followed, and between them they found a rhythm that was imperfect and entirely real. The ballroom had gone almost completely silent. Not the silence of discomfort. Something else. The silence of people who have been confronted with something true in the middle of a room full of performance and do not know what to do with it. Raymond Cross had turned fully around. He was watching from near the fireplace with an expression Nathaniel could not read from this distance. The woman in the pale green dress had stopped her story mid-sentence. The man whose daughter's surgery Nathaniel had paid for was standing very still with his drink halfway to his mouth. None of this mattered to Maya. She spun once on her own, just because she felt like it, and Nathaniel laughed. A real laugh. The first real laugh in 11 months, the kind that starts in the chest and arrives at the face before you've decided whether to allow it. And several people in the room visibly flinched, as though the sound had struck them somewhere they hadn't been expecting. When the music ended, Maya stopped and regarded him with satisfaction. "See," she said. "See," Nathaniel agreed. She leaned forward slightly, with the confidential manner of a child sharing an important observation. "You don't look sad when you dance." He felt something shift in his chest. Not break, shift. Like a door that has been sealed for a long time, not breaking off its hinges, but simply, slowly, opening. "I'm going to go find my mama," Maya announced, as though this had all been a brief stop on a larger itinerary. And then she turned and walked back through the crowd, which parted for her with considerably more gentleness than it had parted for Nathaniel at any point in the evening. He sat alone in the center of the now quiet ballroom. He was aware of being looked at in a way that was different from the invisibility of the past 40 minutes. These were not the eyes of people performing discretion. These were the eyes of people who were ashamed and who were trying to process whether shame was the correct response and whether processing it in public was acceptable, and all of the calculation was so evident on their faces that Nathaniel felt almost sorry for them. Almost. He looked at Raymond Cross. Raymond held his gaze this time. Did not look away. Something in his expression had changed. There was the beginning of something that might have been an attempt at an apology, working its way up through the layers of a man who had not apologized for much in 61 years. He took a step forward. Nathaniel held up one hand. Not aggressively. Simply, not yet. He turned to the waiter standing nearby and asked for the microphone. The room took approximately 90 seconds to understand that he intended to speak, and then it gathered itself. A closing in, a small movement of bodies toward the center of the room, with the instinct of people who can feel that something definitive is about to be said. Nathaniel held the microphone and did not rush. He had given speeches in front of boards, regulators, shareholders, the press. He had once testified before a Senate subcommittee for 3 hours and emerged with his composure completely intact. He was not nervous. He was something quieter than nervous. He was ready. "I want to thank you all for coming tonight," he said. His voice was steady and even, and it filled the room without effort. The acoustics of the ballroom had been designed by an architect he'd paid very well, and they worked exactly as intended. "This was a dinner party," he continued. "But I'll be honest with you, because honesty has always served me better than diplomacy. It was also a test. The room was absolutely still. I wanted to know whether the people who built careers alongside mine, who shared meals and deals, and, in some cases, genuinely difficult moments, I want to know whether any of that existed independently of my ability to walk into a room." He paused. He looked around slowly, not theatrically, not with the pointed drama of a man performing his wounds, but with the specific attention of someone making sure they are seen clearly. "I got my answer," he said. "And I want to be fair to you. Most of what I saw tonight is not cruelty. It's discomfort. It's not knowing where to look when the person you knew primarily as a powerful man is now sitting in a chair that reminds you of your own fragility. I understand that. I spent 11 months being furious at a doctor for suggesting I would need to adapt, because adapting felt like surrendering to something I couldn't accept." Raymond Cross was looking at the floor. "But here's what I also know," Nathaniel said. "I spent a great deal of my life building things. Companies, deals, relationships. Some of those were real. I like to think the relationship I had with my father was real. The relationship I had with George Tanner. Those of you who knew Hartwell Manor in its early years will remember George, who ran our security operations for 14 years. That was real. When George lost his wife, I canceled a $3 million meeting to stand at the graveside with him. I didn't tell anyone because it wasn't anyone else's business. That's what real looks like." He did not look at Raymond during this. He did not need to. Tonight, a child who has no reason to treat me with any particular consideration walked across this room and asked me to dance. She didn't see a powerful man or a diminished one. She saw a man sitting alone at a party who wasn't dancing, and she found that unacceptable. A few people were crying. A woman near the back had pressed her fingers to her mouth. The man with the drink still had it halfway to his lips. "I'm not angry," Nathaniel said. And it was true, he was not. The anger had burned off somewhere between Maya's outstretched hand and the end of the waltz, leaving behind something cooler and more permanent. But I'm also not interested in continuing relationships that depend on a version of me that no longer exists. What remains of me is, I believe, more honest than what I was before. Less impressive, perhaps. Considerably less convenient. He almost smiled at that. "Thank you for coming. The cars will be ready whenever you are. Please finish your drinks." He lowered the microphone. The room exhaled. People began to gather their things with the careful, quiet movements of people trying not to draw attention to the process of leaving. Several tried to catch his eye on their way out, and he let some of them and not others with a discrimination that was neither cruel nor particularly calculated. It was simply the recognition that some things were done and some were not. Raymond Cross walked toward him. He stopped about 4 feet away, which was either respectful distance or the distance of a man who is not certain of his welcome. "Nat," he said. "Raymond." A pause. Raymond ran his hand through his silver hair, which was the closest Nathaniel had ever seen him come to visible discomfort. "I don't know what I can tell you that isn't inadequate," Raymond said. "Then don't tell me anything tonight," Nathaniel said. "I'm not dismissing you permanently. I'm just not ready to have that conversation in the middle of all this." Raymond nodded. He seemed genuinely relieved to be given a delay rather than a conclusion. He squeezed Nathaniel's shoulder once, briefly, the most direct physical contact they had made in 11 months, and walked toward the door. The ballroom emptied. It took about 20 minutes, and by the end of it, the room felt like what it was, a large, beautifully appointed space that had been briefly inhabited and then vacated. The quartet had stopped playing. The waitstaff moved quietly, beginning the careful work of undoing a party. Eleanor appeared from the corridor that led to the kitchen wing. She was still in her working clothes, dark trousers, a white blouse, her hair pulled back, and she looked at the room and then at Nathaniel with an expression he could not immediately categorize. "Maya," he said. "Asleep," Eleanor said. "In the sitting room." "I'm so sorry. She slipped away from me. I didn't realize she'd come in here until—" "Don't apologize," Nathaniel said. Eleanor stopped. "Sit down," he said. "Please." She looked around the room as though checking whether the instruction was meant for someone else, and then she sat, carefully, on the edge of a chair near him, with the practiced posture of a person who has spent a long time in other people's spaces and has learned to take up as little of them as possible. Nathaniel looked at her. Eleanor Marchetti had worked at Hartwell Manor for 6 years. She had been here before the accident and after it. She had navigated the 11 months of his anger and distance and impossible standards with a particular quality he had not allowed himself to name until now, which was grace. Simple, undemonstrative grace. She had not treated him differently after the accident, not more carefully, not more distantly, and he had noticed this without acknowledging it, the way you notice a reliable structural element of a building without stopping to be grateful for it. He had not been grateful. He intended to correct that. "I want to talk to you about the manor," he said. Eleanor waited, hands folded in her lap. "I've been thinking about what it is," Nathaniel said. "What it's been. A monument, mostly. A signal. A way of telling the world something about what I'd managed to build." He paused. "It's a very large house for one person to say something very small." Eleanor said nothing. She was good at that. He appreciated it more than he ever had. "I want to change what it's for," he said. "Open spaces. A real library. Not decorative, functional. Music rooms. Art. A place for children from the district to come after school, whose parents can't afford the programs that children like them should have access to. Workshops. Lectures. Maybe the kind that don't require anything except showing up." He watched her face as he said this. Something in it was shifting. "That's what my father would have made of a building like this," Nathaniel said. "Not this." He gestured at the emptying ballroom. "Not 300 people who came for what they could be seen to be adjacent to. That's—" Eleanor stopped, chose different words. "That would change a great deal of things." "Yes," Nathaniel said. "I need someone to run it. Not manage it, run it. Build it. Someone with actual understanding of what those children need and what their parents are navigating. Someone who has been inside both worlds." Eleanor was looking at him carefully now. "I'm asking if you'll be my partner in this," Nathaniel said. "Not my employee, not my representative. My partner. Equal decision-making on the programs, the budget allocation for community operations, the vision for what this becomes. I'll handle the legal and financial structures. You'll lead everything that actually matters." Silence. The last of the waitstaff moved through the far end of the room. Somewhere in the house, a door closed quietly. "Why me?" Eleanor said. Her voice was steady, but underneath it was the careful tension of a person trying to determine whether something is real before they let themselves respond to it. "Because you've been doing the work without the title for 6 years," Nathaniel said. Because your daughter walked across a room full of people who had decided I was invisible, and she did it without hesitation, as she learned that from someone. And because I've spent 11 months being angry at the wrong things, and it's past time I started asking different questions. Eleanor looked at him for a long time. I need to understand what the commitment looks like, she said finally. For Maya. For our stability. Of course, Nathaniel said. We will work it out properly. With lawyers, with proper contracts, with everything documented and protected. I'm not asking for a gesture. I'm asking for a genuine thing. Another silence. Then Eleanor said, all right. It was not dramatic. It was simply true. And Nathaniel found that he preferred that to dramatic enormously. They sat together in the quiet ballroom for a while without talking. Outside, cars could be heard leaving on the gravel drive. The moon had come out from behind the clouds and was laying long silver shapes across the ballroom floor. The ivory ribbons on the columns stirred faintly from an open window somewhere. Nathaniel thought about his father again. He thought about the dish towel and the kitchen sink and the way Arthur Voss had explained, with the patient simplicity of a man who understood things at their foundations, that the difference between a strong man and a stubborn man was that the strong man knows when to ask for help, and the stubborn man sinks alone rather than admit he needs it. Nathaniel had been sinking for 11 months. Stubbornly, magnificently, and in complete privacy. He thought about the look on Maya's face when she extended her hand. He thought about the way she had said, without drama, without any awareness of what she was dismantling, you don't need to walk to dance. She was right. She had been entirely right. He thought about what Raymond had said, I don't know what I can tell you that isn't inadequate, and he thought that there might be a conversation there, eventually. Not soon, but eventually. Because Raymond was not a bad man. He was a man who had made a series of small choices in the direction of his own comfort. And those choices had compounded into something that looked like abandonment when you were on the receiving end of it. Nathaniel understood that mechanism. He was not entirely innocent of it himself, but understanding it was not the same as accepting it unchanged. Some relationships you repair. Some you let find their own resolution. The important thing, his father would have said, is knowing which is which. He looked at his hands. The same hands that had signed the first papers of the first company he'd built from a rented desk in Manhattan at 26 years old. The hands that had shaken 10,000 other hands across a career of careful construction. The hands that had, tonight, taken the hand of an 8-year-old girl in a red dress and learned something he could not have learned any other way. These hands still worked. The rest of him still worked in every way that actually mattered. Dr. Okonkwo had been right, and he had wasted 11 months fighting it. And the waste was his to account for, and he intended to account for it. He would call the architects in the morning. He would have his legal team draw up partnership documentation that gave Eleanor real structural authority, not the cosmetic kind. He would walk through every room of this manor with new eyes, not the eyes that had seen it as a monument, but the eyes that could see it as a beginning. He would also, at some point, learn to dance better in a wheelchair because Maya would certainly hold him to it. From down the corridor came the small, distinct sound of a sleeping child shifting in her sleep. Nathaniel Voss sat in the quiet center of his emptied ballroom, with the moonlight across the marble floor and the sound of the last car pulling out of his gravel drive, and he breathed in slowly and breathed out slowly, and for the first time in 11 months he was not fighting anything. There is a particular kind of wealth that does not appear in any account. It cannot be signed over or invested or compounded. It accrues in the small moments when we allow ourselves to be seen as we are, and when we look back at other people with the same honesty. It grows in the decisions that cost something, real things, pride and certainty, and the comfortable stories we tell ourselves about who we are. It is most visible not in the grand gestures that fill ballrooms, but in the small ones that empty them of everything false and leave only what is true. Nathaniel Voss had been, by the world's measures, an extraordinarily rich man for a very long time. Tonight, for the first time, he understood what it meant to be wealthy. Outside, the gravel drive was empty and silver-lit and quiet. The manor's windows glowed warmly in the darkness. And inside, in the sitting room off the east corridor, A small girl in a red dress slept with one arm flung above her head and her mouth slightly open, entirely unaware that she had, in the course of one impulsive waltz, changed the direction of a man's life. The rarest quality in a world that worships power is not intelligence. It is not ambition or vision or the ability to execute. It is the simple, radical willingness to see another person fully, without the filter of their usefulness, without the screen of their status, without the comfortable distance of pity, and to extend your hand. Maya had that quality at 8 years old without trying. The rest of us spend our whole lives working toward it. And if this story moved something in you, if you recognize someone in Nathaniel, or in the crowd that turned away, or in the small girl who didn't, then you already understand exactly what it's about. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment below and tell us which moment hit you hardest. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Because every week, we bring you stories exactly like this one, about the moments that change people and the people who are brave enough to let themselves be changed.